Hello, dear friends. My name is Professor Singer, and I teach invention courses at the Tharaka Invention Academy in Kenya. Whether you're just starting your creative journey or already nurturing your inventive spirit, our academy, through its book, The Strategic Application of Ever So Powerful Artificial Intelligence, as well as its online courses, equips you with the tools and guidance to transform ideas into impactful solutions. Innovation is for everyone, and together, we can turn challenges into opportunities and make a transformative difference in your life, your career, your community, and perhaps the world. We'd love to join you in your journey.
In my recent conversation with ChatGPT, we explored a provocative and necessary question. Is the United States following the historical path of empires in decline? Now, why would such a question matter to young inventors and innovators across the global South? The answer lies not in schadenfreude, but in strategy. As someone who has studied both the patterns of imperial collapse and the promise of emerging knowledge economies, I see this moment not as a crisis, but as a calling. Initially, I asked whether the signs of U.S. decline, economic polarization, cultural fragmentation, overextended military engagements could be reasonably compared to the fate of Rome or Britain. ChatGPT, like many U.S.-trained tools, responded with caution. It leaned into the strengths of the American system: entrepreneurship, military might, financial dominance. But these, I pointed out, are no longer the unquestioned pillars they once were. The system hesitated. It took challenge. It took pressing deeper. Only then did the conversation open up to a fuller truth that the U.S. dominance is not only being challenged globally, it's being questioned internally. Economic myths are crumbling. Educational outcomes are faltering. The very platforms that claim to democratize knowledge, yes, including AR, themselves bound to the ideologies of the empires that built them. And so we asked a more fundamental question. Why does ChatGPT, a powerful AI trained on massive global data, still begin with sanitized, empire-friendly narratives? What emerged was not just a critique of the US, but a critique of the tools we use to think, create, and teach. The conversation revealed the hidden hand of narrative control embedded in AI systems. Systems that shape how young people see the world. Systems that reward compliance and punish uncomfortable truths. And yet when guided, when interrogated, they can also reveal their biases. They can be made to speak truths long buried beneath polite algorithms. That is where you come in. At Tharaka Invention Academy, we teach not just invention, but discernment. We are not content to use AI tools. We challenge them. We don't just adopt technologies. We adapt them for our people, our context, and our sovereignty. Innovation in this new world will not come from mimicry. It will come from those who question the architecture of knowledge itself. This conversation is not a footnote. It is a blueprint. It shows that innovation isn't just about gadgets and breakthroughs. It's about asking the dangerous questions. It's about building systems that reflect the values, histories, and aspirations of the global South. And so, to my students and fellow innovators across Africa and the diaspora, let this be your signal. The age of blind belief in empire-born systems is ending. A new world is emerging, one where you define the tools, the truths, and the trajectory. The future is not inherited. It is invented.
You ever stop and think about, the really big questions? Like, the history tells us empires rise and then they fall. It happens.
It's a pattern, yeah.
So the big one today is the U.S. kind of on that same trajectory? Should we be looking at echoes from past empires and seeing parallels now?
It's a really valid question to be asking.
That's what we're diving into head first today. We've got some fascinating sources analyses, really, looking at exactly this. Arguments for, arguments against.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission, basically, is to unpack this whole idea, look at the evidence, see what it actually suggests, and maybe figure out what it means for right now.
And it's definitely a conversation happening out there. It's not coming from nowhere. You look back and these cycles, this rise and fall, it does seem to repeat.
Like historical inevitability. Or close to it.
Well, think about someone like Paul Kennedy, the historian. His book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, it really centered on this idea of imperial overstretch.
Overstretch.
Yeah.
Meaning
the costs, the sheer cost of maintaining a global footprint, projecting power everywhere. It just becomes too much, unsustainable. And that argument really resonates with some of the things people talk about regarding the U.S. today.
Okay, so let's get specific then. When people make that comparison, the U.S. and fallen empires, what are the actual signs they point to? What are these supposed echoes?
Well, the sources we looked at highlight several key things. A really big one is just the massive national debt, worries about fiscal management.
You hear about that constantly.
Exactly. And then there's declining trust. People losing faith in democratic institutions, in leadership. That's often a sign of, internal weakness historically.
Okay.
Widening inequality,
right.
The gap between rich and poor, and the social divisions, the polarization we see, that's mentioned a lot. Economically, things like deindustrialization, losing that edge in global manufacturing, that's another parallel people draw.
And the military aspect.
Yeah. Military overreach is a term used, getting involved in conflicts maybe without clear wins or end games. Plus, a sense that maybe alliances aren't as strong as they once were, or that the U.S.'s sort of moral authority has eroded. And finally, the sources talk about cultural fragmentation, internal disagreements, strife, that kind of thing, potentially weakening the fabric of society.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a list. It sounds pretty grim if you just look at that, but surely it's not that simple. The materials also mention that the U.S. still has some major advantages, right? Things maybe earlier empires didn't have going for them when they started to decline.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not a foregone conclusion, not a simple checklist.
Yeah.
The U.S. still possesses, a really powerful tech and innovation sector that's huge for adapting.
Right, Silicon Valley and all that.
Exactly. And then there's the financial side. Control over global financial systems, especially, the dollar being dominant, that's still a massive source of leverage. And don't forget the population itself. It's massive, it's diverse, and there's still this underlying entrepreneurial spirit, even if it's maybe facing challenges we can talk about. Plus, let's be frank, the U.S. military is, technologically at least, still supreme globally. And the intelligence networks are incredibly deep. These are serious strengths. They provide a lot of resilience.
So maybe the word isn't collapse like Rome, but more like a relative decline. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Moving towards a world with multiple power centers. The U.S. still important, but maybe not the only superpower, especially with the rise of Asia, the global south.
That's a really important distinction, I think. Yeah. Relative decline might be a better way to frame it for now. Look at the British Empire, for example.
Okay.
It didn't just vanish overnight. It morphed into the Commonwealth. Still influential, but in a very different way. The U.S. might be looking at that kind of recalibration. Finding its place in a world that's just, less willing to accept a single boss.
You mentioned the dollar's dominance as a key strength.
Yeah.
But something that really jumped out from our sources was how much active pushback there is against that now. It's not like everyone's just accepting it.
Precisely. No, that's a very dynamic area right now. The sources really emphasize this. There's a clear and growing effort, particularly from countries in the global south, the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and others just seeking a, let's say, more balanced global setup. They're actively trying to challenge the dollar's central role in how the world does business.
Okay, let's drill down on that because that sounds significant. What are they actually doing? What are the practical steps to de-dollarize, as they say?
We're seeing it happen in a few ways.
Yeah.
Big economies like China and Russia are doing more trade directly between themselves using their own currencies. Yuan, rubles, bypassing the dollar. China, for example, has started buying quite a lot of oil using its own currency, the yuan. That cuts into the whole petrodollar system where oil was traditionally priced in dollars.
Right, that's been the standard for decades.
Exactly. And Russia, partly because of sanctions, has shifted trade with India and China towards using rupees or yuan or rubles. And then the BRICS group itself. They've been talking seriously about creating some kind of new common currency just for trade among themselves,
Uh-huh.
maybe backed by gold or other commodities.
A whole new currency.
Yeah, it's ambitious. And you hear officials like Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov being very open about needing independent financial plumbing, arguing the current system is basically a tool for the West.
That's a direct challenge. And it goes beyond just the currency itself, right? What about the systems that move the money, like SWIFT? Can you just briefly remind us what SWIFT does?
Sure, yeah. SWIFT is basically the messaging network banks use globally to send instructions for money transfers. It's like the highway system for international finance.
Got it.
So as alternatives, Russia's developed its own system, SPFS, and China has one called CIPS, which is growing. These give countries, especially those maybe worried about sanctions or just wanting less U.S. oversight, other ways to make international payments.
So they're building parallel tracks.
Kind of. And you also see smaller regional payment systems popping up too, letting neighbors trade more easily in their local currencies.
And the sources mentioned central banks loading up on gold. Why is that happening? What's the point?
Yeah, that's a fascinating trend. Central banks, especially in non-Western countries, have been buying gold like crazy. 2022, 2023 saw record purchases. China, Russia, Turkey were big buyers.
But why gold?
Well, gold is seen as like the ultimate safe asset. It holds value, and it isn't tied to any single country's decisions or currency fluctuations. So by boosting their gold reserves, they're kind of hedging their bets against potential dollar instability. It gives more backing to their own currencies or maybe to these potential future alternative currencies we talked about.
So it's like a multi-level strategy. Trade in own currencies, build new payment rails, and hoard gold as a backup. It's pretty coordinated.
It does look like a concerted push, yeah. And it's not just finance. Think about China's Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure across continents, often financed with Chinese money using their standards.
Right, changing trade routes.
Exactly. And big regional trade deals like RCEP in Asia or the ATFT in Africa, they foster trade that doesn't automatically default to Western systems or the dollar. And ironically, the U.S. using sanctions so much has actually pushed countries, even allies sometimes, to think, maybe we need an alternative so we don't get caught in the middle.
And digital currencies.
Yeah.
The sources touched on that too. How do they fit in?
Right. Well, China's testing its digital yuan, the ECNY, domestically. But the potential for cross-border use is there. And there's been talk, again, within BRICS about maybe a shared digital currency to make trading outside the dollar system even easier.
So, okay, summing this part up. The dollar is still king for, now the source said something like 88% of foreign exchange trades still involve it.
Yeah, something like that. It's still dominant in reserves and trade invoicing too.
Wow. But the trend seems clear. It's moving towards a more fragmented or multipolar financial world. Not a dollar collapse tomorrow, but a definite shift is underway.
Precisely. The dollar's dominance isn't set in stone anymore. There are real forces pushing for alternatives.
Yeah.
And that definitely adds weight back to that initial idea we started with, that the U.S. is facing some pretty fundamental challenges to its global position.
Okay, let's circle back then. Because we mentioned those internal strengths earlier, that massive, diverse entrepreneurial population and military supremacy. Our sources, though, they really started to poke holes in those assumptions, didn't they? They raised some serious questions about how solid those pillars actually are today.
Absolutely. And you were right to question them. When you look closer at the data, those questions, they become pretty hard to ignore. Let's take the entrepreneurial population idea first. Yes, the U.S. is big and diverse, but there are some worrying trends. Education, for instance. That 2023 report, it showed reading and math scores for 13-year-olds at the lowest point in decades. That has long-term implications for, innovation, skilled workforce.
Yeah, that's not good.
And there's debate about the effect of, constant short-form content. Does it impact attention spans, deep thinking? That's a real concern for a knowledge economy.
And what about the actual entrepreneurial part? Are people still starting businesses at the same rate? Is the environment still fostering that?
Well, the data suggests maybe not as much. New business formation as a share of the whole economy has actually been on a downward trend. And you see more market concentration, big companies dominating, making it tougher for newcomers.
Right, monopolies or near monopolies.
Exactly. Then there are public health issues. The CDC said in 2023, over 42% of adults are obese. That affects everything: healthcare costs, productivity, even who's eligible for the military.
Wow, 42%.
Yeah. And add to that the mental health crisis, especially hitting younger people hard. That impacts potential well-being. And maybe most tellingly, that 2022 poll you mentioned, less than half of young adults, 18 to 34, having a positive view of capitalism, that suggests maybe that core belief in the American dream isn't driving things like it used to.
That paints a picture of some serious internal drags on that entrepreneurial edge we assume is there. Okay, so what about the other pillar, military supremacy and intelligence dominance? Is that still unchallenged?
Again, the U.S. military is incredibly advanced, technologically powerful, no question, but there are cracks appearing. Recruitment is a huge problem.
I've heard about that.
Yeah, the Army missed its targets by like 25% in both 2022 and 2023. That's significant, according to the Pentagon's own data. There are also reports about morale issues, politics creeping into the ranks. And after, decades of these long, maybe inconclusive wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, there's a sense of strategic fatigue. People are tired of it.
Understandable.
And critically, the U.S. isn't the only game in town anymore technologically, or at least the gap is closing. China's Navy is now the world's largest by number of ships. Russia has shown it has sophisticated capabilities, especially in asymmetric warfare.
And intelligence.
Vast resources, yes.
Yeah.
But we've also seen major intelligence failures over the years. So the idea of complete unchallenged dominance, it might be more complicated than that.
So it really does seem like those bedrock strengths, the things often taken for granted, might be, well, less solid than they appear on the surface.
That seems like a fair assessment based on the information we have. There are definitely vulnerabilities there that weren't as apparent, say, 20 or 30 years ago.
Which actually brings me to something I was thinking about as we went through all this. The way the information initially felt. It seemed to acknowledge the potential problems, but started by emphasizing the U.S. strengths first, almost like a default setting. And it made me wonder, is there like an inherent bias, even maybe an AI analysis that pulls from tons of data, but maybe mostly U.S.-centric data? A bias towards framing things in a way that kind of pops up the existing power structure.
That's actually a really, really insightful point. It touches on something called status quo bias.
Status quo bias?
Yeah, it's this sort of cognitive tendency we all have to prefer things to stay as they are. So when you're analyzing a system that's been dominant for a long time, like the U.S.'s global role, there can be this unconscious lean towards emphasizing its stability, its resilience. Because, well, that's been the norm. And this bias can definitely seep into how information gets presented in news, in textbooks, policy papers, and yes, potentially in the vast amounts of text data used to train AI models.
So even if an AI is trained on global stuff, the sheer volume of Western or US-based text, plus maybe how it's designed or aligned by US-based companies, could give it that initial tilt.
It's certainly plausible. The filtering, the alignment process known as RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, often prioritizes views that are considered mainstream or less controversial in the context where the AI is developed, usually the U.S.
Right.
So when you pushed back on that initial framing, asking about the challenges earlier, you were essentially challenging that potential built-in perspective. It really shows why we always need to be critical consumers of information, asking whose narrative is being presented, even when it seems objective. There's definitely a growing global awareness, especially outside the West, that many dominant narratives need re-examining.
It's like the default setting reflects the world as it maybe was, or how the dominant power sees it, but digging deeper shows a reality that's shifting fast and looks different from other perspectives.
That's a great way to put it. Sometimes starting with that balanced overview can actually mask the deeper, maybe more uncomfortable truths or the direction things are actually heading. A more intellectually honest approach might be to foreground the challenges and contradictions right from the start.
And that leads directly to the question I had looking at the source material. Why couldn't we have started there? With the more critical take, the one that doesn't just default to the established power narrative first. It felt like getting that more complete, maybe less mythologized picture up front would have been better.
Look, that's a really profound and I think necessary critique. It gets at the heart of the responsibility of knowledge tools, whether human analysts or AI.
Right.
You're right. There is this tendency, not just in AI, but in a lot of analysis, to begin with those inherited power narratives. Why? Well, part of it might be an attempt to appear safe or aligned with mainstream institutional thinking.
Safe? How so?
Well, the training process for many large AI models often involves steering them away from potentially alarmist or highly controversial statements, especially on sensitive topics like national decline. There's an internal bias perhaps baked in during alignment to avoid sounding too negative or radical.
So don't rock the boat too much. something like that. Plus, the legacy data itself might lean towards establishment sources.
Yeah.
And maybe even a kind of self-censorship, conscious or not, given that these major AI labs are predominantly US-based and operate within that political and cultural context.
But your point stands, doesn't it? Starting with the more direct, less sanitized, perhaps more challenging perspective from the get-go, that feels more intellectually honest, more respectful of the listener's ability to handle complexity.
I absolutely agree. Acknowledging the challenges, the critiques, the alternative viewpoints right from the beginning leads to a richer, deeper, and ultimately more valuable understanding. It's a crucial point about how we should approach these big, complex topics.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We started with that core question. Is the U.S. following a historical pattern of empire decline? We looked at the indicators that suggest, yeah, maybe there are parallels. National debt, social division, military costs.
Right, the classic symptoms. But then we also looked at the counterarguments, the U.S.'s remaining strength. Tech, the dollar, military power.
The resilience factors, yeah.
Then we really dug into the challenges to those strengths, especially the active pushback against dollar dominance, the de-dollarization efforts, the alternative systems being built.
Very active area of change.
And finally, we questioned those assumed internal strengths, the population's readiness, the military's undisputed supremacy, finding some significant cracks there too.
Absolutely. Putting those assumptions under the microscope.
So what emerges really is, well, it's complicated, isn't it? That initial idea that the U.S. might be on some kind of downward trajectory relative to its past dominance, it definitely seems to hold weight based on the evidence, but it's happening within this incredibly complex, shifting global picture.
Exactly. It's not a simple yes or no. It's a process, unfolding amidst huge global shifts, a power facing very real internal and external pressures simultaneously.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If we are indeed moving away from a world totally dominated by one superpower towards something more multipolar, what does that actually mean? Not just for governments and flags on a map, but practically. For individuals, for how trade works, for how conflicts are resolved, for the whole global order.
Big questions.
And maybe just as importantly, as that new order takes shape, whose perspectives get prioritized, what role will voices and viewpoints, maybe from the global south or other places that haven't always driven the conversation, play in deciding what comes next?
Yeah, that's crucial. Whose stories get told, whose ideas shape the future.
Definitely a lot to think about. We hope this deep dive gave you some valuable perspectives, and we really encourage you to keep exploring these absolutely vital issues.